Hello and welcome to our monthly mental coronavirus Q&A session, and thank you for joining us today. The content of this webinar do not purport to provide any financial, investment or professional advice, and nothing in the content of this webinar shall be deemed to constitute the provision of financial investment or other professional advice in any way. During this session today, we will be covering three key areas. Number one, the recent announcements from the government. Number two, the upcoming challenges for businesses as we head into the winter months. And number three, what new lockdown restrictions mean for your business. We will also be referring to our own Mentor Live system throughout, and you can register to use this for free of charge by clicking on the coronavirus Read More button on the Mentor website. My name is Michael Aburn, and I'm joined by three of Mentor specialists. We have Catherine Watmore and Susan Galashan for employment law, and Darren Heather for health and safety. All participants are on listen only, and we encourage you to ask questions as we go along via the Q&A button. When you leave the webinar, you'll be asked to give us your feedback, as we'd really value hearing what you think and what else you'd like us to help you with for our next webinar. We do try to answer as many questions as we can during these weekly sessions. And if we can't get to yours, we do use your questions to update our FAQs within the coronavirus area on Mentor Live. So let's just jump straight in then, guys, with the announcement from the government last week and indeed this week. So I'm going to start with a question for you, Catherine. So, you know, we've had businesses here that are able to return most of their employees to work, but I know that a lot of them are still relying on the furlough scheme to keep their businesses going, because business is slow for a lot of people. Now, the government recently announced the Job Retention Scheme. So, simple question, Catherine, what is this and how can it help me? Oh, you are on mute, Catherine. Still on mute. There you go.
Perfect, thank you. Hello everybody, and delighted to be on our panel again today, and thank you all for taking time to join us. So it's been increasingly apparent that COVID-19 is going to have a negative effect on businesses for quite some time, and the question that was in everybody's minds as autumn approached was whether the government was going to offer any further financial support to employers when the job retention scheme comes to an end on the 31st of October. And the good news is that the new job support scheme will help out with a contribution to wage costs when employers are unable to provide their employees with their normal hours of work, although they do have to be doing some work. So the scheme is aimed at supporting viable businesses, and it gives employers quite a lot of flexibility to move employees on and off the scheme as business needs for work change.
Fantastic. All right. So let's get a bit specific about it then. So I'm going to ask you, Susan, when does the job retention scheme start and who can apply for it? So how does it work?
Well, first of all, hi everyone, and thanks Michael for inviting me to be on the panel for the first time today. So the new job support scheme is going to run for 6 months from the 1st of November until the 30th of April. And the main rules are that employees will have to be working at least 1/3 of their normal working hours, and they have to also have been on the payroll by the 23rd of September. And what that means is the HMRC must have been notified that they're on the payroll by that date. So what will happen is that employers will have to pay employees for the hours that they have worked as normal, but then they'll also have to pay them for 2/3 of their normal working hours that they haven't worked. But the government will then reimburse part of that payment back to the employer for the unworked hours.
Right. Okay. Thank you, Susan. Catherine, as well, I've heard a rumour that not all businesses are actually eligible for the job retention scheme. Is there any truth to that?
Well, all SMEs apply, but actually we're still waiting confirmation from the government as to the definition of that. But for larger businesses, they will need to prove a loss of turnover due to COVID. But it's probably worth making clear that employers won't be permitted to issue any redundancy notices to employees who are on the scheme.
Right. Okay. Got you. Thank you very much. Susan, I just want to understand the figures a little bit. So what sort of proportion of wages is it going to reimburse?
Right, so the government grant that you'll get back will cover 1/3 of pay for the unworked hours, and that will be up to a maximum of £697.92 per month. Unfortunately, it won't cover pension contributions and won't cover employers' national insurance contributions. But the full details are still to be published yet. Hopefully they'll be with us soon. But we do know that claims will be made online, similar to the furlough scheme, on the gov.uk website. But grants will be paid monthly in arrears starting from December. So employers will have to pay up front and then claim the government proportion back the following month.
Right, okay. Yeah, I think I'm getting this, but I'm still a bit confused, and I think a lot of our people on the webinars are. I think an example would be good. So Catherine, I've got one person asking here. So they've got half their normal work to offer staff. So how does this scheme work for them?
Yeah, I think it's worth having a look at examples because it is a bit confusing on the face of it. So in the case where an employee is only able to work 50% of their normal hours, the employer has to pay them as normal for those hours that they are actually working. And they also then have to pay them 2/3 of the pay that they would have earned for the remaining unworked hours. So in that situation, the employee is actually entitled to 83% of their normal wages. The employer will pay 66%, and the government the 17%, as Susan said, up to that maximum of £697.92 a month. So that's how that would work in practice.
Right, so the employee doesn't get 100%, they get 83%. Fabulous. Thank you, Catherine. Now, Susan, a couple of questions coming here as well. How does it fit with the current job retention scheme, so the furlough scheme, and also that £1,000 job retention bonus?
So the job support scheme is a brand new scheme, not linked to the job retention scheme and furlough at all. But if you have been using the furlough scheme and you do have some work for your employees to do, then it does mean that you can continue to get some support with wages, albeit on a much reduced scale. The job retention bonus, something else again, this can be claimed in addition to any grants that you might get through the job support scheme. And the bonus provides a one-off payment. It's £1,000 for every employee who's previously been furloughed and who remains continuously employed with you at least until the end of January 2021. They also need to be earning at least £520 a month on average between the beginning of November and the end of January in order to qualify for that £1,000 payment.
Right, fabulous. Thank you, Susan. And Catherine, do employees actually need to agree to be part of this job retention scheme?
Yeah, it's a good question and a practical point that shouldn't be overlooked. Yes, employees do have to agree because what they're agreeing to is not to be paid for 1/3 of their unworked hours. So there's needing a change to their employment contract, which should be agreed with them and notified to them in writing. When full details of the scheme have been published, then we hope to put some helpful template letters to cover that on our Mentor Life Coronavirus Hub.
Right, fabulous. Thank you. Now, Susan, I just want to go back to the last question on the job retention scheme. I know we have lots of questions on it, but we've got other things that we want to cover as well. Please do keep the questions coming in, though, because we will be updating our FAQs with those questions. So if you don't get the answer here, please do check that later. It's just in relation, we had a question coming in on something you said about it being separate from the furlough scheme. So does the new scheme apply only to workers who've previously been furloughed?
No, that's the good bit. Your employees don't need to have been furloughed at all before in order to take part in this new scheme. They just need to be officially on your payroll by the 23rd of September.
Right, got you. Thank you very much, Susan. Yes, brilliant. As I say, we are going to move on from that, but do keep the questions coming in still. We will update the FAQs because I do want to look at changes to the businesses for the challenges that are coming ahead. Darren, I'm going to bring you in now, if that's all right, because health and safety expert here. Now, I've got clients and customers, begun to get people gradually back into work. They completed their COVID risk assessment in July. Is that still okay? Is that sufficient?
Thank you, Michael. Good question. And good morning, everyone. It's really nice to be back in doing the COVID-19 webinar. Yeah, it's a good question, but I think implied in the question is that there are changes, and I think that would trigger the need to review the assessment. When you're bringing people back, there is going to be potentially some issues with your social distancing and other controls. So I think it will be very, very important to look at that risk assessment again and review it against your changes, but also the new government guidance changes as well. You may need to look at also some of your mitigating factors and whether they still apply in your new setup with people coming back. It would also be very, very useful because, again, with changes to the workforce in terms of people present, to re-look at your training, because one of the aspects of the COVID-19 Hub for Mentor and also from companies' risk assessment is how do we then communicate our measures and train people on the awareness of COVID-19. So that will be useful to look at as well. And then also we've now got the track and trace app from the NHS, and that may be something you want to get your employees to sign up to. Again, you'd need to reflect that within your risk assessment. So I would think generally it's a very, very good idea. If the original risk assessment was July, you really ought to be reviewing that again.
Right, okay, understood. Thank you, Darren. And you've mentioned there as well the track and trace system. A few questions on that actually. So Catherine, I'm just going to come to you for that. This one client, they run a gastropub. They've got a question coming in. They're required to gather data about their customers. However, they're concerned about data protection and GDPR. So can you give them some tips around the track and trace?
Yeah, well, just a bit of background on that. So in England, from the 18th of September, all businesses in the hospitality sector, pubs, restaurants, hotels, hairdressers, cinemas, zoos, anywhere that provides an on-site service rather than just an immediate takeaway are required to collect customer data to assist with the track and trace. And that also applies to the hospitality sector, the NHS Wales, Test, Trace and Protect, and Test and Protect in Scotland. And this is mandatory. This is a legal requirement. This is not the same, to be clear, as premises displaying the QR codes linked to the NHS app and having customers scan as they enter the premises. That's not a legal requirement yet, although encouraged to do so. So the need is to gather names, contact numbers, dates and times on site, both for staff and for customers and visitors. And that's really in a way that's manageable for your business, digital if possible. But if your existing booking system and reservation system gathers that information anyway, then there's no need for you to put a second system in place for the track and trace. But just displaying the QR code is not enough to meet those obligations. So the Information Commissioner's Office, who are responsible for the enforcement of data protection compliance, have provided a 5-point checklist. And if you follow those, then you should be legally compliant in how you handle that information. So what they're advising is only ask for what is actually needed. So there's certainly no need to ask health information, for example. Be transparent about why you're collecting that data and, importantly, what you're going to use it for. Store it carefully, so under lock and key if it's a paper version or otherwise password protected. Limit those who have access to that information on what's known as a need-to-know basis. So don't let contact details be viewed by other customers or by staff who don't need to see that data. Don't use it for anything that you didn't actually collect it for. And importantly, make sure that it's securely deleted after the required period, which is 21 days here. And perhaps make that part of your sort of daily routine to delete that. And the other important thing to think about is that you should have an appropriate privacy notice. So that will explain how you will use and protect your customers' information. And your visitors are entitled to be given this, but how you do that is really up to you. So you could display a notice or direct people to your website where your privacy notice would be displayed.
Brilliant, thank you, Catherine. As you were talking, I had a number of questions on a similar topic. I think I know the answer to this one, but a lot of people are asking it, so I'll ask you. can we use the data we gather for marketing purposes, as this would be really useful?
Well, it certainly would be, but unfortunately, in brief, the answer to that is no. As I think you predicted, test and trace information shouldn't be used for other purposes unless this has been carefully explained to your customers in advance and, importantly, consent has been given. But in simple terms, unfortunately, no.
I did think as much, but thank you. Yes. Catherine, final question on this. What are the penalties if you don't get it right?
Well, that's important because the government has said that there will be fixed penalties for organisations who don't comply, and there are already heavy fines which can be imposed for breach of GDPR. And of course, I think you need to also think about your reputational risk if that information gets into the wrong hands. So all sorts of reasons for making sure you get it right.
Fabulous, thank you, Catherine. Moving on from track and trace, I'm going to ask you a question, Darren, health and safety related. Now, we've been told about the self-isolation rules when you have symptoms of COVID or a positive test, and the need to identify people you have been in contact with. What constitutes contact?
Yeah, thank you, Mark. It's a very good question. There's three elements to the description of contact, which is published on the NHS website in support of COVID. And the first one, it's a sliding scale list, really. The first one is fairly obvious, close physical or close personal contact. And really that would be if you have been face-to-face with somebody less than a metre, for any length of time, talking to them, actually gives the example of coughing on them, fairly obviously, and any kind of physical contact, that's clear, that's a contact. Now, we go back to the next level, which is being within 1 to 2 metres. So that's within the 2 metre social distance, but over 1 metre. And if you've got that, for example, a close sort of team task for more than 15 minutes, that will constitute contact. The example they give on the website is traveling in a small vehicle. But equally, if you were doing a task with a colleague in fairly close proximity, if that was the 15-minute rule there, then that would constitute contact. The third descriptor is a little bit more broad. It actually says spending lots of time in your home, such as cleaning it. To extrapolate that to a work-related scenario, that would be if you have a group of people spending an awful lot of time together in one particular area, that may need to look at that in terms of contact. In order to protect the company for that you may need to look at how you could break teams down and look at how you could create your work bubbles or cohorts, which could protect that. But those are the three key descriptors of what contact means.
Okay, well, I want to explore what you just said there about protecting the businesses, actually, Darren. So how can businesses protect themselves from an employee having a positive test? I mean, would you just have to close the business if that happens? You're on mute, Darren.
Sorry about that. Not necessarily, because again, I gave a little bit of the game away there in the previous response. If you can look at your workforce that is at work, and if you can divide those up into work bubbles, a good example I had recently was a logistics company I deal with. They've got a team of logistics workers in a warehouse. What they've managed to do is actually break those down into 3 smaller teams. And therefore, the impact of a positive test there is much reduced on that business. You're technically, instead of having 8 or 9 people have to isolate, you're really only talking about 3 people having to isolate. So again, that's a real benefit for the business. You could look at attendance rotas. You could look at how you could limit the amount of time people are on site, and sharing that workplace could be part of that. You could also look at the tasks themselves. I described a task where you had a small team working on a task. Can you do that task differently? Can you actually introduce some social distancing to that task? That will be interesting to do, because that, again, that will protect that contact strategy. And I think finally as well, again, reinforcing this, getting your employees to download the Track and Trace app is also a very good idea in terms of managing that part of the process.
Fabulous. Thank you very much, Darren. Catherine, again, a few questions about redundancy, and of course it is unfortunate if we have to take that route. And I know that the furlough scheme is coming to an end, and people are having to take a longer term view about their staffing requirements. Now, a lot of people do want to retain as many staff as possible. So what alternatives to redundancy may be open to me, Catherine?
Well, of course, there may be many reasons why retaining staff is a long-term best option for employers, despite the lack of work. And that's aside from the payment of any job retention bonus that Susan mentioned, if you are able to still have staff employed who've been furloughed in January. And employees, of course, may be willing to consider changes if that allows them to keep their jobs, so that there are a number of options to consider. For example, you could invite requests for voluntary redundancies, or the sort of so-called early retirement as an alternative to making compulsory redundancy. It's really important that that is handled fairly and in a non-discriminatory way. I mean, not, for example, just offering voluntary redundancy to your older employees. And it's important to make clear that that's not an automatic if somebody does request it, because obviously you may want to retain your most experienced and skilled employees. There's quite a lot of scope as well about looking around changing working hours with employees' agreement. You could, for example, move away from fixed hours to flexible hours, or even 0 hours contract. Making a permanent change to the contract of employment, but perhaps putting in place some review dates. So that's subject to review as business needs change, or stop working altogether for a short while. So have a look at your contracts of employment. They may allow employers to impose short-time working and layoff as a temporary measure, and maybe think about updating contracts if it doesn't allow that contractual right. But you would need employees' agreement to that change. Maximise use of the government funding. I think it's, financial directors and controllers will be getting their calculators out and doing various options and looking to see what financially is going to be in the best option. Looking at reducing costs, use of temps, contract workers, reducing overtime, recruitment freezes, perhaps not backfilling vacancies. And then finally, I think just really thinking about the wider picture and whether you could retain staff by retraining them. There may be parts of your business where actually you have got a greater need, and by putting some training in place, you might give people the chance to move over to another part of your business. So quite a lot of things to think about, I think, as time goes on and the impacts become more entrenched.
All right, fantastic. Yeah, some really good examples of different things you can do there. Thank you, Catherine. Darren, I have a really interesting question for you here. It's well, when I go to the supermarket, for example, there's a one-way system. They've got lines on the floor. It works really well. But this person is struggling to actually implement that due to the nature of their layouts of the premises. So what can they do?
It's a good question, Mike. It's interesting you raise the supermarkets. I think we've learned quite a lot from how the supermarkets have managed the risk of COVID. And as you say, in terms of supermarkets, you've got well laid out aisles, you've got wide aisles, you can actually implement a one-way system relatively simply. But you're right to say that other premises, it's not that simple. It isn't an issue in terms of you having to put a one-way system in. There are other options that you can look at. And again, looking at things like crossing points. So instead of having a one-way system, can you have a point where people could cross at a distance? That could be one area. You could have give way signs. So in other words, you have an area. I had one recently with a small engineering company, a very narrow stairway. And so what we introduced was actually a give way process at the top and the bottom of that stairway, which works effectively very, very well. The other thing we have introduced, which is a little bit more tricky in some respects, but I think we are getting used to this, is where you have to walk around the common areas of a building. And if it is a building which doesn't lend itself to having a one-way system, then really the implementation of wearing face coverings is a pretty good idea, because ultimately you're then protecting everybody. Ultimately what you're saying is at your workstation, your 2 meter distance or 1 meter plus with your mitigation factor, you may not need to wear face covering. As soon as you get up and move around that premises, it will be a good practice to pop on face coverings. One-way systems are really good if you can adopt them. but they're not necessarily all for all businesses. I actually think they probably work better. The supermarket's a good example of where you have the public coming onto your premises and you need to control the public in terms of where they go. For businesses that are not public facing, these other measures could be a little bit more practical to introduce.
Brilliant, thank you very much. And thank you to the people who mentioned a bit of distortion there from you, Darren, but rest assured where we are fixing that. Another question actually for you, Darren, because I want to move on. We are getting questions about the new lockdown restrictions, and I think this is a really important topic to cover. Winter months are coming, we know that, and lockdown restrictions are getting stronger. So, Darren, it's tricky, right? Because I know a lot of businesses have worked really hard to make it safe for their staff to return to work. Are they now being asked to close their offices again until the new year? And so with the recently announced new restrictions, are people still allowed into work?
The answer is probably yes, but it does depend on their job function. And really what we're being asked to do now with the new guidance and the new announcement is to really look at that again and decide, can people effectively and successfully work from home? And if the answer is yes, then we should introduce or continue or reintroduce some home working elements to that. That's really what we're being asked to do. Where people can't effectively work from home, really the emphasis then on relooking at the COVID safe environment. And as we mentioned earlier in the risk assessment, that will be a really important part of that, looking at your risk assessment again. But you should also take into account for people that are having to come back to the workplace that can't work from home, is take into account their personal circumstances, looking at the travel that they have to make in terms of to and from work could be part of that risk assessment again. And then consider how that's going to manage in terms of the workplace, but also your home workers. Really, it will be looking at also the maximum number of people you could safely accommodate on site that can't work from home. Can that be done in a phased way? And some of the other measures that we've already talked about, rotas, staggering the return to work could be part of that as well. And also, really importantly, keeping in touch, which I think a lot of my clients have done very successfully, keeping in touch with the people that are working from home, managing that process, but also monitoring your conditions at the workplace. So ensuring that your COVID safe controls are working for all and balancing that out in terms of the people that are having to or can work from home and the people whose job really entails them having to come to work.
Brilliant, thanks so much for that, Darren. To follow up on that, actually, Susan, a question coming your way. Can employees now actually insist on working from home if they've proven it can be done?
This is a really difficult one for employers at the moment. The official advice is certainly in England has changed recently, and now it's, certainly office workers who can work effectively from home should do so over the winter, is what's being said. So employers really should, in those circumstances, make arrangements for people who fall into that category to return to home working if they have been back in the office, if they possibly can.
Fabulous. Thank you very much, Susan. Catherine, as well, is it okay for me to ask some staff to come to work and let others work from home? You're mute.
To build on what Darren and Susan have said, I mean, this is almost moving into 50 shades of grey as the government guidance, but I think ultimately it does require a flexible approach where possible. So yes, the answer is situation may be different for each employee, and employers will have to continue to work closely with each employee, consulting with them and considering, as we've said, the most effective place for them to work. And that's likely to be home if they're office-based in most cases, how safe it is for them, taking into account their journey, their health, other responsibilities. And I think it's really important that employers are open and transparent to avoid any perception by employees of any sort of unfair differential treatment, and really to keep records of their discussions with staff, because there is no simple answer in many cases. It's about balancing all the different risks and obviously what's right for the employees and what's right for the business as well.
Fabulous, thank you, Catherine. And final, not final, Susan, what's the position now about employees who should be self-isolating. So I'm getting a few on this. They should be self-isolating. Can they come into work if they want to? Or can we ask them to come into work even?
So the short answer is no. Employees who have to self-isolate for whatever reason should be doing so. Employers shouldn't be either encouraging them to come into work or even allowing them to come into work. And you've probably all seen this week's headlines about fines of up to £10,000 in England for employers who allow employees to attend the workplace after they've been advised to self-isolate through the track and trace system. So it's just not worth the risk, either health-wise or financially.
Brilliant. Okay, so just a clear answer there. Absolutely not. Thank you very much. Now, I just want to touch on, go back to a couple of different things, because a number of people have been asking about the job retention scheme, and even have been going through. So I don't think that well, I'm not fully there yet. I don't think our audience are fully there. So Catherine, I'm just going to come back to you. Can you, just in simple terms, re-explain the job retention scheme, to explain what it is, how much the employer has to pay, how much the government pays, how they get the money back, and how much the employee receives? I can go over those again if that's too much.
Okay, so just the headlines are, first of all, you have to have some work available for the employee to do. And they have to be paid for the work that they're actually doing at their normal rate. You can then make an application for the government to contribute to the unworked hours. The employee has to be paid for 2/3 of that, and the government grant is up to 1/3 of the amount of the hours that they're actually doing. So we don't know the full details of how the grant can actually be claimed, but we believe that is online. And we have put together, from the information that we have got, some frequently asked questions on our coronavirus hub with some of those worked examples. I won't go through the figures again, but I think the worked examples really do help to explain how that works in practice. I don't know if Susan's got anything to add to that, but that's a sort of an overview. And I'm not surprised that businesses are finding it complicated, because it is breaking down percentages of thirds and 2/3, and you know, it does require a calculator, I think.
Absolutely. And so what percentage does the employee get as well? That question's coming up a lot. So what will the employee see in their bank account percentage wise?
Was that was in terms of a overall payment by the employer?
Yeah, so I'm an employee. How much will I get in my bank account at the end of the month?
Yeah, so they have to get their normal pay plus 2/3 their pay for their unworked hours.
Right. Okay. Fab. Excellent. Okay. Now that brings us to the end of our coronavirus hub. So thank you very much to Darren, to our webinar. Thank you very much to Darren, Catherine, and Susan for your time today. There will be an email with you shortly giving you useful website links, including a link to the Mentor website. If you click on the Coronavirus Read More button, you can register to use Mentor Live free of charge. The coronavirus section provides access to FAQs, letter templates, the risk assessments, which Darren mentioned there, and much more. It also has the registration details for our future webinars. We do offer a 3-month advice service, which is chargeable. And if you want to know more about any of our services, our contact details are available on the Mentor website. Thank you for all your questions. They are appreciated. I know we haven't got to all of them today, but we do use those to update our FAQs. So please do check those out in the next couple of days after this webinar. Please do take a minute to give us your feedback and leave us today as you leave today's webinar. And that leaves me to thank our panelists for sharing their expertise, and to thank all of you for joining us today. Thank you very much, and goodbye.